Most of my research over the course of my career has focused on public opinion and electoral politics. So I've studied a lot voting behavior and partisanship and the nature of public opinion, how people think about policy issues, questions of representation, about the connection between public opinion and public policy. And that was the general set of questions that I had in my mind as I came to this specific project. And the specific focus on inequality and social policy had in part to do with big changes that had gone on out in the world. Not only scholars, but observers of American society generally have increasingly noticed over the past few decades the amazing increase in economic inequality in American society. And that was something that I was interested in trying to understand better using the kinds of tools and theories that I had been exposed to and developed in the past. And so it was a connection between a real policy problem out there in the world on one hand and my own toolkit and the set of ideas that I had on the other hand. The question that I started with and that motivated me to think more concretely than I had about economic inequality was the issue of representation. And it turned out to be one chapter toward the end of the book that I wrote that looked at the extent to which policymakers in Washington seemed to be responsive to the preferences of affluent people and middle class people and poorer people. So that seemed to me to be a really interesting and important issue about the workings of democracy. And in that scheme of things, the cause and effect were really that on one hand there was public opinion about inequality and there was inequality among people in their role as citizens, and on the other hand that would produce government policies of some kind as elected officials either responded or didn't respond to different kinds of people's political views and preferences. But as I got further into that, I also became interested in the other side of the same relationship, with the impact of policy on inequality and the ways in which the decisions that policymakers have made over time have influenced the trends that we've observed in terms of increasing economic inequality. And so the first part of the book turned out to focus more on the impact of politics on economic inequality, and then at the end came back to the question of the impact of economic inequality on politics. For me, research always involves some combination between thinking about both what other people have already done and said and written and about what sorts of data might be available in order to explore the questions that I'm interested in. Sometimes I have a pretty specific notion of how to do that, and sometimes much less so. One aspect of the book that I was interested in from the start was the issue about unequal responsiveness of public officials to the preferences of different kinds of citizens. And for that purpose, I had in my head going in a particular data set that seemed to me to be really potentially quite helpful in answering that kind of question. It was survey data that had been collected for an entirely different purpose. People were interested in studying Senate elections, and as a result, they interviewed lots of people in each of the 50 states, regardless of whether it was a big state or a small state, to find out what their views about a variety of questions were that might influence their votes for senators. But because of the special structure of that data set, it made it possible for me to estimate the preferences of people in different income groups within each of the 50 states, and then relate those preferences to the behavior of the senators who represented those states in the Senate. And so that was a specific kind of analysis using a specific set of data that happened to be available that I thought would shed light on this broader question. When I turned to looking at the impact of partisan political choices on economic inequality and patterns of income growth, it turned out that there were all sorts of data that were useful for addressing that question that had been available for a long time, but simply hadn't been analyzed from the perspective that I was using. So mostly that part of the project involved getting data that are posted on the Census Bureau's website and other government websites that simply tabulate the economic experience of people in different parts of the income distribution. And what I did was to break those patterns down to look at differences in experience for different kinds of people under Democratic and Republican presidents in order to use those data that had existed for a long time in order to shed light on the particular questions that I was interested in. And then for some other parts of the study, there weren't relevant data available, and I actually was involved in designing new surveys that asked people questions about their views about inequality and their views about tax policy and related issues in ways that made it possible to address questions that otherwise wouldn't have been as readily researchable. The trajectory of the book and the range of topics that it ended up addressing evolved over time. Over the course of the research, I probably spent 5 or 6 years doing the research for the book, and it started out in one place and ended up in a variety of different places. In terms of the findings, I would say that many of the findings were, in terms of their general outlines, probably not surprising, but in terms of the magnitudes of the differences that I observed, for example, between the responsiveness of elected officials to affluent people and poor people, or in terms of the magnitude of the difference in the experience of ordinary citizens in terms of income growth under Democratic presidents and Republican presidents, turned out to be much larger than I would have guessed going in. I think most political scientists come to their work with more or less firmly held views about all sorts of political issues, and I'm probably less partisan and less political in my views than many people who study American politics for a living are. I was interested in the issue of inequality, and so I think was poised to think that the way the parties addressed that issue in particular was of importance. I was surprised when I got into the data analysis to find out how stark the historical differences in performance between Democrats and Republicans turn out to be. There is a literature in political science that has documented differences with respect to a variety of different policy outcomes between Democratic and Republican administrations, sometimes in ways that clearly favor one party or the other, more often I would say in ways that connect to value choices that people may make in different ways about what's most important to accomplish. This is an area where, to the extent that people are concerned about increasing economic inequality specifically as a social outcome, it appears that the historical record of Democratic presidents over the last 60 years or so has been markedly better than the performance of Republican presidents. One of the important themes of the book is about the different policy choices that tend to be made by Democrats and Republicans, especially between Democratic and Republican presidents. And so the implication of the analysis would be that a new Democratic president would invest a good deal of his political capital in trying to produce policy outcomes that would work to the advantage of middle class and poor people. And I think that's something that President Obama has invested a good deal of political capital in. A lot of the specific aspects of the stimulus package that were adopted in the wake of the financial meltdown in late 2008 had that kind of flavor. A lot of the budget choices that the administration has made, I think, have important implications for economic inequality. The way the healthcare reform was designed, I think, will have pretty substantial implications for the relative inequality of people's access to healthcare, and also in terms of the kinds of subsidies that are being provided for people who haven't been able to afford health insurance to have access to it in a way that hasn't been possible before. So all of those, I think, are examples of the kinds of things that Democratic presidents have historically been more willing to do than Republican presidents have. On the other hand, there's this theme in the analysis in the book that politicians are generally less responsive to the preferences of people with low incomes than they are to the preferences of affluent people, and that's true even for Democrats. And I think if you look at the specifics of the policies that have been adopted to deal with the financial regulation issues that arose in the wake of the Wall Street meltdown, and to think about the way the government has dealt, or mostly not dealt, with problems in the housing market and the problems of home foreclosures, you see that there still seems to be a lot of sensitivity in the contemporary political system to the economic interests of affluent and even super affluent people. There's a lot of controversy about specific policies that have been debated and in some cases adopted over the last couple of years. I think part of what's going on is that the people who come to the policymaking process with Democratic partisan loyalties are likely to think that what the president and Congress are trying to do is going to be helpful somehow, whereas the people who come with Republican predispositions are likely to think that whatever happens, it's not going to be good. The cultural and opinion bases for the latter view, I think, have partly to do with a long-standing suspicion that Americans have about government and about the role of government. And so when the president says that we need huge increases in government spending in order to get the economy out of recession, there are a lot of people who think that that's an implausible recipe for economic success, and that what the government should do is to spend as little money as possible and give the money back in tax breaks to ordinary citizens and to businesses. There's a lot of faith generally in the American public in the free enterprise system and in the way that businesses, if they're unfettered, are likely to contribute to economic growth. The other piece of this, in my analysis of people's opinions about the big Bush tax cuts that were adopted about a decade ago, it turned out, although there were certainly partisan and ideological explanations for why people supported or opposed those tax cuts, one of the big elements in accounting for people's enthusiasm for the tax cuts was their own feeling about their own tax burdens. I refer to this as unenlightened self-interest, that lots of people who thought their own taxes were too high were in favor of a tax cut, even though it was engineered in such a way that their own tax reductions would be quite small, and most of the benefits would go to people who were much wealthier than they are. And so I think part of what people are grasping for in their assessment of the current policies that are being debated or adopted is some sense of whether those policies will be good or bad for them specifically. And much of the politics of this has to do with middle-class citizens and their sense of whether this is something that is going to be good or bad for them. And it's very difficult for them to know that, obviously, because the policies are so complicated and they're going to play out over a long period of time. One of the things that political scientists have a lot of difficulty bearing in mind, and I suspect even some of the students who take political science courses have difficulty recognizing is how little attention many ordinary Americans pay to the political process and to policy issues. It's not that they don't have anything in their head, they have all sorts of attitudes and values that are relevant to important political decisions. The problem is that they don't know enough about the details of policy often to figure out how to connect those values and preferences to particular kinds of policy preferences. And the work that I did on people's attitudes about the big Bush tax cuts that were passed about a decade ago now really illustrates that kind of issue, because there were lots of people who had strong views on one side or the other with respect to basic kinds of questions about values. They recognized that economic inequality had been increasing. They thought that was a bad thing, but at the same time, they thought it was a good idea to have these big tax cuts that went mostly to wealthy people, because they didn't make the connection between their egalitarian values and the specific policy issues that were on the table. Maybe they were Republicans, they heard that President Bush was in favor of this. They thought it generally sounded like a good idea because their own taxes were pretty high, and they thought a tax cut would be a fine thing in a way that had, I think, an important political consequence, but probably wasn't entirely integrated with their broader views about the big issues of American politics. I have a variety of things that I'm studying now, some of which are pretty closely related to the kinds of questions that I was studying when I wrote Unequal Democracy. One new project that I've been involved in is a detailed survey analysis of the political preferences of really wealthy Americans. My own work suggests in a kind of indirect way that those people are likely to be pretty consequential in the policy-making process, and other political scientists have been doing work along the same lines, but we really know surprisingly little about what the views of those people are and what issues they care most about. They're such a small fraction of the population that they don't really appear at all in the general surveys that we conduct to ask people about their political views. And so this is a project that tries to find really affluent people and get them to talk about the way they think about American society and government and the policy problems that face us, in order to be able to make more detailed comparisons than we can right now between their preferences and priorities on one hand and those of the rest of the American population on the other. Another big project that I've just started to get involved in is to study policy responses and responses in terms of public opinion and attitudes in response to what's now being called the Great Recession, the economic crisis that we've lived through for the past couple of years, and to do that both in the United States and in lots of other countries in order to get some sense of, first, whether the nature of the crisis was different here than in other places, whether the reaction of ordinary citizens to it was different, how that was shaped by differences in political culture and partisan views, and what party happened to be in power in any given country at the time when the crisis hit, and then to try to trace through the different policy choices that different countries have made and what effects they have on economic growth, on economic inequality, and on the quality of life of people in these different societies. So that's something that I think will play out over a period of time as the crisis itself unwinds and as the responses to it begin to become more clear than they are right now. I think I'm probably unusual in having gotten interested in political science at a pretty early stage in my undergraduate career, actually. I came to college having read books about campaigns and politics and being kind of interested in that, and more or less just by chance happened upon a political science course in my first semester of my freshman year, which was a course mostly about political methodology and modes of political analysis rather than about any specific subject. But it was something that really caught my interest and led me to recognize that this was a set of tools that one could use to apply to all sorts of interesting questions. And so I got interested in taking a variety of political science courses and thinking about lots of interesting issues that arose in the course of them. And so at a pretty early stage in my college career, I started to think about the possibility of becoming a political scientist. The other profession that I thought about in the back of my mind and was interested in was to be a rare book dealer. And I took a terrific course in the basement of the rare book library where we got to handle old books, and I got really interested in that. But at some point I decided that if I was going to do that, I'd have to learn Latin, and it was too late in life to learn Latin. So I went to graduate school in political science instead.